welcome to today's webinar, Keeping Classrooms Clean, Breakfast After the Bell Logistics. Before we really get started today, I just wanted to share that if you have any issues with the technology or if you have any questions throughout the webinar, please go ahead and type those into the questions box. Emily, our associate, is joining us for the webinar, and she'll be happy to field those during the webinar for us. So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Kelly, and I am a program manager with the No Kid Hungry Center for Best Practices. Here in this role, I develop resources and tools and provide technical assistance and training around the school breakfast program. Thank you for joining us today. We're very happy to have you join us to learn more about this subject. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker for today. Joining me is Zetta Riker. She's a current No Kid Hungry consultant and former Food and Nutrition Services Director.
Good morning, and thank you for hosting us, Kelly.
Thank you, Zetta.
Just a quick note, I guess, about my background. As Kelly shared, I am worked with No Kid Hungry and was a former food service director. I have implemented a variety of different breakfast after the bell programs and have worked, at this point, have implemented about 50 schools in large urban school districts to implement breakfast after the bell programs. So I've pretty much seen a pretty wide variety of all different types and models that have been implemented.
Great. Well, we'll be hearing more from Zetta later, and I'm just so happy she's joining us here today to share her experience and expertise. So as far as our agenda for today, I'm going to share a brief overview with you of No Kid Hungry and our Center for Best Practices. We'll then cover some breakfast after the bell basics and move into keeping classrooms clean. We'll conclude with a highlight of some of our breakfast resources and an opportunity for audience Q&A. So let's talk for a few moments about No Kid Hungry. No Kid Hungry is a campaign of Share Our Strengths, and we are committed to ending childhood hunger in the United States. Nutrition programs like school breakfast already exist to feed kids. The problem is that these programs are often underutilized. So we're working here to increase access and ensure that more kids get the nutritious meals that they need to learn, grow, and thrive. Within our No Kid Hungry campaign is our Center for Best Practices. As I mentioned, I'm a program manager focusing specifically on breakfast within our Center for Best Practices team. And overall, our Center for Best Practices is comprised of program, policy, and research experts committed to providing information and resources to help end childhood hunger. So what do we actually contribute? Our team offers a number of resources to help those of you and other stakeholders in their fight against childhood hunger. We offer resources, toolkits, webinars, peer-to-peer guidance, and much more. So now we're going to move more so into breakfast after the bell, and just taking a few moments to highlight the basics before we move into the elements of keeping classrooms clean. So we know that despite the benefits of school breakfast, the program is often underutilized. And that tends to be because there are common barriers that exist which prevent students from eating school breakfast when it's served in the cafeteria before the official start of the school day. Those common barriers include a stigma that school breakfast is for students from low-income families, students arriving late to school, sometimes because the buses are arriving late or their carpool does not arrive on time. We often see older students may not be hungry first thing in the morning. Sometimes it's that the cafeteria is not convenient for students, be it that the cafeteria is on the opposite side of the school building from where students enter and perhaps on the opposite side of where their classrooms are. Perhaps the cafeteria does not have the capacity to seat all of the students. So there are a number of reasons why the cafeteria might not be a common, convenient option. We also see sometimes that students prefer to socialize rather than eat alone in the morning. So students need to leave the socialization area, say that students are otherwise in a courtyard or a gym. They may choose to stay and hang out with their friends rather than seek out breakfast, even if they are hungry. So that's why more schools are making breakfast a part of the school day with breakfast after the bell. Breakfast after the bell addresses these common barriers and ensures that more students are able to start their day with breakfast. Breakfast after the bell is one of the most effective ways to significantly boost school breakfast participation. And what breakfast after the bell does is shifts the time that breakfast is served so that it's part of the school day and moves breakfast from the cafeteria to where students are. And that can be their classrooms or that can be other common areas within the school. And these three models that are highlighted on the screen, breakfast in the classroom, grab-and-go breakfast, and second chance breakfast, these have proven most effective at resulting in higher breakfast participation rates, which of course means that more students are starting their day with a nutritious meal. So now we're going to shift into looking into the specifics of each of these models a bit more and really looking more so at how you can keep classrooms clean. What are the tips and tricks to ensuring that the implementation of breakfast after the bell goes smoothly and is well received by everyone within your schools? So with breakfast in the classroom, breakfast is served and eaten in the classroom. We see some variety in how breakfast gets to the classroom. Students or school nutrition staff may deliver breakfast to classrooms from the cafeteria via coolers or insulated bags. And then what does cleanup look like? So what we typically see is that it's a very student-led initiative. That students clean up their desks using supplies provided to classrooms like wipes, napkins, and placemats. This is where when creating your plan for cleanup, you'll want to make sure that classrooms are equipped with these supplies. These supplies can either be delivered daily with breakfast, or classrooms can be stocked with cleaning caddies that are refilled regularly. After breakfast is eaten, we see a couple of options as well. Student helpers can either return equipment and uneaten breakfast to the cafeteria, or these items can be left just outside of classrooms for school nutrition staff to collect. As it relates to what happens to the trash that students have generated from their breakfast, students can either place their trash in a separate trash can designated for breakfast inside the classroom, which can be picked up by a custodian or brought to a centrally located hallway trash can by a student helper. We find that cleanup methods are going to be very school specific. So if your school is okay with each student, exiting the classroom and disposing trash in the hallway, that can be done. If the school's preference is to instead have one designated student who removes the bag full of trash and brings that to the hallway, that's another option. And as we're going to see highlighted throughout these models, while these have been identified as overall best practices, we always encourage you to find what's best for your particular school environment. And with that, there's going to be a number of different factors that can be considered for your exact cleanup plan. Some of those factors include student enrollment, your building layout, and custodial staff capacity. But we wanted to cover today what we typically find to be most effective. We're now going to speak a bit about grab-and-go breakfast. Grab-and-go is a model where students pick up conveniently packaged breakfast from mobile service carts in one or more central locations. These central locations are going to be where the students are. So either where the students are entering the school or where they're congregating in the morning. This can be hallways, entryways, or it can be the cafeteria. Students eat either in their classroom or a common area. We see that this model is most often used in middle and high schools because it's flexible and it can accommodate varying schedules and students that are on the move, which we traditionally see more so with older students. As far as cleanup for grab and go, if it's a grab and go to the classroom model, cleanup looks mostly like breakfast in the classroom cleanup, which we just discussed. Since food is ending up in the classroom, we're going to have those same practices in place where the students are leading the cleanup efforts, in their desk space, and the custodial staff is providing support. If it's grab and go to a common area, students will discard their breakfast in trash cans that are centrally located in the area. Lastly, we're going to take a moment to highlight second chance breakfast. This is when students eat breakfast during a break in the morning. This is often after first period. Schools can serve breakfast either in the same manner that they would with a grab and go model, or by reopening the cafeteria and allowing students dedicated time to eat before they return to class. This model can be particularly effective for older students who, as we highlighted earlier, may not be hungry first thing in the morning. And what does cleanup look like for second chance breakfast? It also looks very similar to grab and go breakfast or traditional breakfast. And again, that's going to be based on how exactly second chance breakfast is being offered in the particular school. So what else have we heard? So we're fortunate in the position that we have to be able to connect with schools all across the country. And sometimes we pick up tips and tricks along the way. I've heard things like, don't serve fruit cups at breakfast, save those for lunch. And that is an ode to taking things that might be a little bit messier and still having them as part of your overall meal pattern, but maybe saving them at a time when there's a little less concern about them. Another tip I've heard is to provide plastic straws so that students can poke through the top of juice cups and not peel back the foil tops, which minimizes the risks of spills. Provide each classroom with a cleaning caddy stocked with wipes. So those can be like antibacterial wipes, something like Purell or Clorox, extra napkins for any messes or spills, and disposable placemats. So those are things that students can place on their desks, eat their breakfast on top, and clean up in one fell swoop of just tying up their placemat. Lastly, we've heard some schools that provide an individually wrapped wet wipe with each breakfast so that students can clean their hands and desks. So again, these are things that we've learned that are happening out in schools. Each school has different wants and needs. We definitely want to emphasize that. What works well for one school may not work as well for another. You need to find the best fit for yours, and we're happy to help you find that fit. However, one thing we know for sure is that you need plenty of trash cans. No matter what breakfast after the bell model you're offering, it's very important to have ample trash cans. With breakfast after the bell, you may hear concerns about increased trash and pests associated with breakfast after the bell. If you have a strong cleanup plan in place, which includes plenty of strategically placed trash cans, this should not be an issue. And now I'm going to turn it over to Zetta.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kelly. So I'm going to discuss a couple areas that I would consider to be quote unquote hot spots or tension points that I just wanted to share with the group to highlight and consider when they're in the planning process and implementation process of implementing a breakfast after the bell program. So one of the biggest areas is definitely, if for those of you that are coming from a nutrition services department, you'll really want to make sure that you reach out to other departments within your district. And certainly, absolutely, would be custodial services. In some districts, custodial services is within a larger facilities department. Sometimes they're on their own. It kind of depends. So you'll need to know, I think generally it's recommended to go, straight to the director, whether the chief operations officer, and have an initial meeting with them and talk the details through and really involve them in the beginning to find out what is, the current status of their department and any other struggles that they might be working on or priorities. It's good to become familiar and, start the relationship early. One thing I think would be good to share is that, especially for breakfast in the classroom models, so these programs will impact the custodial staff, the school site staff, in terms of their workflow. And in the custodial world, that's referred to as runs. So it's a lot of districts and a lot of custodial staff have specific things that they do throughout the day. And at this time, they're, going through and cleaning these classrooms. At this time, they're going through and emptying out these bins and those sorts of things. Those are called runs. So when you implement, for example, a classroom model, their run is going to shift from, let's say, they're no longer going to be cleaning the cafeteria in the morning. However, so that kind of frees up time for them, but it does impact their time later on if they are having to go through the hallways and pick up trash cans from central places throughout the campus. So there's a shift. So it's really important that you meet with the supervisors and the director first to kind of talk this through a little bit and the impact of how that's going to change. In some cases, you may want to also interact with the unions, but again, it really depends on the district and the specifics of what what the needs and wants are of your specific schools and districts. Okay, you want to go to the next slide? Another important part for custodial services is there will be hopefully an increase in waste because you'll have more students participating. Even if their students are consuming most of the meals, even just the packaging will create an increase in waste. So as Kelly mentioned, you'll definitely want to make sure that you'll be able to order additional trash bins. But another thing to consider is that when the trash is actually put into dumpsters, sometimes this will, some schools will go from like a 10%, breakfast participation to, 85, 90%. And you'll potentially have a couple hundred more students having breakfast every day. So that amount of waste on a daily basis can be substantial depending upon your packaging that you're using. So it's important to flag this to custodial services in that it may cause the dumpsters to overflow. And so it would require them to have an additional pickup from their waste provider. And those of you coming from nutrition services know that adding pickup days from your vendors sometimes can take some negotiation and timing and things like that. So it's important that a review of the amount of volume, trash volume, and dumpsters and pickup times and number of pickups per week is looked at ahead of time. Okay, next slide. Another note I wanted to just highlight really quickly. I'm not sure, but here in California, green and sustainability programs are becoming pretty prevalent. And what I mean by this is that, so diverting waste from landfill and diverting it into recycling, compost, and if possible, going into what we call a food share or food recycle. I'm not going to spend too much time on it today, but the pictures on the slide here are just some examples of how we have done it here in California. It's actually been really nice in that we found that students that participate in this program, the sorting of the waste in the classroom from breakfast, it actually makes sorting during lunchtime even better because they're getting exposure to these sorting practices in the classroom where it's a little bit more of an easier setting for them to absorb the information and go through the practices. So those of you that are interested, just please let us know and we can provide more lessons learned and tips and tricks on that. Okay. Another important part to consider a hotspot is unfinished milk. Now this is milk that is from an open container. Let's say, you know, a student they selected a milk and they only drank half of it. What do you do with that leftover milk? This is important because for classrooms, not all classrooms have sinks, and those that do have sinks, they're generally hand sinks. And you'll see on the slide, there's a picture of a pipe, and it's a U shape, and it's a trap. And it basically, if you dispose of milk in the hand sinks, the milk will collect at the bottom of the trap and will not only cause an odor, but can actually, at certain points, you know, dry up and actually clog the sink. And obviously that's a problem. So again, this depends on your custodial services and what they are okay with, but generally, as a best practice, I highly encourage schools to not use hand sinks to dispose of milk, and instead to use either a plastic jug of some sort to collect the milk, and then that milk, the jug goes back to the kitchen to be disposed of. An important lesson learned is to choose a jug that has a really wide mouth, as wide as possible, just because it gives the students a little bit more area to pour the leftover milk into. Those classrooms or those districts that do want to use the hand sinks, you can. It's just important to make sure that the teacher or a student runs the water a little bit once the last student has poured their milk to clear the trap. So that is one option, but it's just one more little task that's important to remember. Okay, next slide. And so Kelly touched on this a little bit in terms of, you know, how to design your menu. Those of you, you know, that are menu designers and nutrition service staff, you know that with school food, it's not just, you know, taste and acceptability of the menu items. It's, you know, how the menu item ships and, you know, the packaging that goes along with it. So this becomes really important, especially for grab and go and for in the classroom. So one of the recommendations that I always give is you want to look at your menu, and if you can, actually sit down and eat the menu item for yourself and see how does it feel, how does it work sitting at your desk. Are your hands getting sticky when you open and eat the muffin? Is there, you know, crumbly toppings on that muffin that are, you know, messy? Things like that. So you'll really want to test them out in real time and look at it from a classroom standpoint. Definitely, you know, encourage you to not serve things, fruit that requires students to peel, such as, you know, a navel orange or something like that. It gets students' hands really sticky, and the peels tend to be a little bit messier for cleanup. One item that I also encourage schools to not put on the menu in the classroom is, at least in the beginning, is cereal. Even though it is a kid favorite, it is very difficult to clean up. Again, it's because of the leftover milk and having to pour it into the jug. It can be very messy. So generally what I encourage schools to do is to hold off, at least on the beginning of your program in serving cereals, and wait until classrooms and students have gotten their process down a little bit and have gotten comfortable with the program before adding cereal back into the menu. Yeah, I've also got the picture of the bagel on there, because that's another example of, you want to think of in terms of the amount of time it takes to eat a menu item. So for example, if it's possible to send a bagel already with the cream cheese in an overwrap, rather than sending an individual bagel with the cream cheese on the side, because it does take some time for students to put the cream cheese on the bagel. Some districts I've seen will use like a squeeze packet for the cream cheese to put on, and that does make it a little bit quicker. But so these are all just examples of certain things to consider as you're designing your menu. Okay,
and I will just jump in real quick for a second and say that recently I did a site visit at a school, and to kind of solve what I'll call the bagel dilemma, they encourage a rip and dip practice with their students for bagel eating, which spares the use of extra utensils, and also helps with the spreading and mess factor. So they encourage their students to instead put the bagel into the cream cheese. So again, just one of those tips and tricks you kind of pick up along the way that I thought I would share with you.
Yeah, I love that. I love the rip and dip. Elementary kids especially love cute little things like that. So actually, that's a good segue into the next point that we wanted to share. So with all of these breakfast after the bell programs, the main idea is that you're integrating breakfast with the school day. And one important element is to engage the students as part of the process, and have them have active roles in the design of the program. And so on the slide here, we just have some examples of some just cute names of different tasks for students. And this example I realize now is one where a school is sorting. So, you know, compost captain, landfill leader, recycling ranger, those sorts of things are just cute little names. I've heard of one school that wasn't sorting. There was like a waste wizard that they assigned. And so students have active roles, and, you know, it depends on the teacher if they want to rotate it by day or once a week or once a month, or however they assign student roles. But generally, especially elementary students, they really, really get into having these roles and having these jobs and playing an important part.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Zeta, for sharing your experience and expertise with us. And Zeta will be staying through the end of the webinar to answer questions with me. So please, you can start entering your questions if you have them into the questions box. And we'll get to those in a few minutes. But now I just wanted to take some time to remind you that we are here to help. And in one of the ways that we can be helpful is through the resources that we have from our Center for Best Practices. I've highlighted some of our resources within this slide deck. These are what I like to call our greatest hits. These resources on this slide in particular are helpful for introducing breakfast after the bell, especially to teachers and principals. We have a resource that summarizes the different breakfast after the bell models. We have a set of talking points that are helpful for introducing breakfast after the bell to different school stakeholders. We have a resource that's designed for educators to show how the funding that supports school breakfast and lunch makes its way to schools and is part of a different funding stream than the school's general fund. And lastly, we have frequently asked questions by educators about school breakfast. These resources highlighted on this slide are particularly helpful for addressing concerns around breakfast after the bell, like that it causes a mess and takes away from instructional time. So these resources include breakfast after the bell myths, which highlights some common myths that persist about breakfast after the bell, and the facts that highlight the reality of breakfast after the bell. We have a teacher guide to classroom setup and cleanup, which is, of course, very relevant to the subject of today's webinar. And we also have a resource that highlights the nutritional quality of breakfast after the bell and highlights the nutritional guidelines that the program must follow. So within this slide deck, I've hyperlinked some additional resources, but what I really want to call attention to is the fact that these resources and nearly 400 others are available on our Center for Best Practices website. So while given the subject of this webinar, I've just highlighted our breakfast resources. We also have resources about summer meals, after school meals, and a number of other topics related to the federal child nutrition programs. So if you have not previously visited our Center for Best Practices website, I encourage you to do so. And in a moment, I am happy to open it up to your questions. So as I've shared previously, please type any questions that you have into the question box. But one of the things that I really want to highlight is that either if for any reason time doesn't allow us to get to your question today, or perhaps you have a question that's very specific that involves follow-up, the webinar software actually allows us to track the question and who asked it. So if you ask a question in today's webinar, I will be able to follow up with you via email to make sure that we get you the answer to your question. Okay, so I have a couple of questions coming in here. And one of the questions that actually, Zeta, I'm going to see if you can help us answer, is what are the different methods you've seen used for counting breakfast for reimbursement? And I can add to that too. Zeta, are you okay to get started with that?
Sure. Well, there are, I mean, it does obviously depend on if the school falls under community eligibility, provision 2, or the standard or school breakfast program. So I have seen for community eligibility, classrooms are allowed to just do a meal count. So they count the number of students that pick up a reimbursable breakfast, and they write in that total number on a form. So the cafeteria provides a form. They send a paper with the breakfasts every day inside the transportation carriers, if it's a thermal bag, a cooler, those sorts of things. And then the teacher writes in the total number of meals served, reimbursable meals served, and then it's sent back to the cafeteria every day. I have seen some schools that are under the school breakfast program, under the standard, so claiming under free reduced paid, where they will have a student roster. Generally, that has become more rare these days because of the, expansion of community eligibility provision. And generally, schools, if they have a lower FRL percentage, they're not going to be doing breakfast in the classroom. So, and rosters can be very, very tedious to record the information on a daily basis. It's important that you work with your point of sale provider to ensure that you're setting it up in a as efficient way as possible. I hope that answers with enough detail.
I build on that too. So Zeta highlighted a number of ways, and she touched upon these as well. I think what we most commonly see, particularly as it relates to breakfast in the classroom, is that a class roster is included in kind of the pocket of the insulated bag, and that teachers will check off who received a breakfast. I've actually seen schools where so many students are receiving breakfast that it's actually the opposite. Teachers will check off who is not, because that's more efficient. I've seen schools use like a dry erase sheet for these rosters that eliminates the paper waste. But where those rosters end up after breakfast service is back in that pocket so that they're returned to the cafeteria where the nutrition staff then input the breakfast counts into their POS system. I've also seen some creative solutions where students have ID cards for breakfast. This is something that's also helpful with little ones. They can have pictures on them. This is a great way, as Zetta highlighted earlier, to engage students as leaders. And students, if they get a breakfast, they can put their ID card into the yes envelope or the yes folder, or if they opt not to get a breakfast, they can put their ID card in the no folder. And then similarly, those counts will be turned over to the cafeteria staff for them to accurately enter those into the POS system. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Okay, we have some questions here. So one of those is, how often do schools restock cleaning caddies, and do dining staff restock cleaning caddies? So I can start with that, and I would say that how often schools restock generally is going to be school dependent. It's going to be dependent on what is stocked in those caddies and then what is being provided each day with breakfast. Sometimes schools have just a recurring schedule where they restock the caddies, but I also know of schools where it's kind of by request. So teachers, just like they're sending rosters back to the cafeteria for the school nutrition staff, they can also check off a form letting the school nutrition staff know what other supplies they need, and then those refill supplies can be brought back. I would say most oftentimes we do see that that's something being handled by school nutrition services, but it may be done in partnership with custodial services. Again, that's where it does get into the specifics of the school. So is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
The only thing I think I would add is I think if schools are using a form, they're sending a form every day to use for counting and claiming. We've also added a section on that sheet where schools can send a message to the nutrition staff if it is the nutrition staff that is refilling the supplies, and they'll check off what additional supplies they need, and then the cafeteria staff will send it the next day, or they'll fulfill the order at that point. There are different methods in terms of tracking how much and how often schools are allowed. That is, as you said, Kelly, is tends to be specific set. There are different. It depends on the school and your nutrition department how much you want to allow them to give.
Great, thank you, Zetta. Okay, so looking here, we have a question around a concern related to feeding kindergartners in the classroom. And the question relates to whether or not schools have implemented breakfast in the classroom, but the kindergartners continued with traditional tray line in the cafeteria. So what I'll say to that more broadly is that we do often see schools implementing hybrid breakfast after the bell programs. So where they will find that certain models work better for some of their students than others. I think the key there is when thinking about what I'll say a grade-specific model is that in order to be most effective, you would want those kindergartners being served their breakfast after the bell. When we think about those barriers that we highlighted earlier in the webinar, in order to really make sure those barriers are addressed, we'd want to make sure that the students are present. So I think that that's something that can definitely be done. We see that happening. And then again, the school would just have to work out the best plan that allows them to be serving the dual models. But using hybrid breakfast after the bell models is definitely something that we see. Any additional thoughts, Zetta?
Yeah, you want to be able to tailor, because yes, kinders are different than fifth grade. You definitely want to make that clear and give kinder teachers a little bit more support when you implement, even possibly having an additional person there the first couple days. Generally, kinder classrooms have more parent volunteers and aides, so just encouraging them to really have them be involved as well. One note of caution that I've learned over time with doing hybrid models, as Kelly had said, making sure that it is after the entire school is after the bell, and you don't keep, let's say, some serving some in the cafeteria and then before school, and then doing some in the classroom. Number one, because it's a real challenge in terms of counting and claiming accurately, but also just from a family perspective. A lot, if they have a family has multiple children in the school, it can be very difficult for one student to have breakfast, every day in the classroom, and then another family to have to, get there early, or have them go through the line. So just something to consider. I think in my recommendations now, it's having everybody be in the classroom and just giving a little bit more extra support and care and TA to kinder teachers up front.
Great, thank you. And I do want to acknowledge we did get a question that was asking for some specifics on the types of wipes that schools are using. And that's something that I'm going to follow up on. And if anyone is interested in additional information, again, feel free to put that through to the question box and I will follow up by email. We're fortunate to have a great team of breakfast consultants and champions that we work with. So I'm happy to reach out to get some specifics on the particular brands or product numbers that they're using, just if people are curious around the options that exist. I have another question here that relates to increased meal waste with breakfast in the classroom. So we do know that we do often hear of the topic of increased food waste, and there are a number of ways to address that. One of the resources that we have, which I'll be sure is shared with you in follow-up communication, is a resource specific to strategies to reduce food waste. One of the most important aspects with this is going to be proactive, and that is meal planning. It's really important when offering breakfast after the bell, particularly breakfast in the classroom, to be paying attention to breakfast participation numbers and also participation specific to certain menu items. We can acknowledge that at the start there might be a bit more waste while things are getting figured out. But for example, if your school nutrition manager knows that Mondays are consistently pancake day, and on pancake day participation is high, more breakfasts are going to be sent to the classrooms. But if it's consistently shown that Wednesdays are banana bread day and banana bread just isn't as popular with the students, they're going to know to send less of those to the classroom. So that's something that really is addressed mostly on the back end with strong planning and procurement. But there are a number of other strategies that can be put in place after the fact, like share tables. So I will make sure that that resource is shared with you all. Zeta, is there anything that you'd like to add to that?
It's a tough element to manage. I know some schools will, if they are serving cold menu items, they will serve them again one other additional day, the following day. A lot of times they'll serve it to the younger students because they don't mind as much having the same menu item twice. But it does depend on if, it has to be all cold items and things like that because you can't serve a hot item twice, obviously. But yeah, that the waste is you have to really be careful with your food safety protocols and your local health department regulations as well.
Great, thank you. Well, I think there are just a couple of questions that we were not able to get to in the interest of time. But as I shared, I will make sure to follow up by email with anyone that asked a question. And with that in mind too, like I said, if there's another question that's come to mind or something that you'd prefer email follow-up, go ahead and type those questions in now, and we will get a report out from our webinar system. But now, as we're within the final minute of today's webinar, I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of you for joining us. And a thank you to Zeta for sharing your experience and expertise with us. Stay tuned for more information about our upcoming webinars. We will be announcing the dates for those, and some of the topics will include the financial benefits of breakfast after the bell, breakfast promotion and marketing ideas, and meal counting and claiming with breakfast after the bell. So you would find out the details about those hopefully through the same means that you found out the details about today's webinar. So if you are not sure if you're on our email distribution list, please reach out. You'll get the post-webinar email, and you can reach out to us if you're not sure. And speaking of, within the next couple of days, you will receive a follow-up email that will include this slide deck. So that means all of those resources that were hyperlinked, you will have easy access to those. And that email will also include the webinar recording. So again, if you have any last-minute questions, go ahead and type those into the question box, and we will make sure to get you the answers that you're looking for. And again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope that you will be joining us for some of our upcoming webinars in the future.